Takeoff. The home point has been updated. Please check it on the map.
Hey everybody, it's Jonathan here with Drone Academy, and today I want to take a few minutes to talk about some of the settings on your drone and how to use them to properly expose your shots. So by this point, everybody knows that drones are amazing and you can get some phenomenal aerial photos and video from using them. But just like any other camera, it's only going to be as good as the person using it. And also, just like DSLRs or other cameras, modern drones have tons of useful settings that can change the look of the imagery coming out of it. So to help you get the best possible imagery out of your drone, I want to take a few minutes to go over some of these basic settings and see how you might adjust them given the environmental conditions. And we'll briefly touch on things like focus peaking and resolution, but the bulk of this video is dedicated to using ISO, shutter speed, and aperture if your aircraft has a variable aperture to properly expose your shot and make sure it's not too light or too dark. Because what most inexperienced pilots do is this, and that's shoot in auto, which is arguably one of the worst things you can do for multiple reasons. Before we get into setting the exposure, I want to make sure I'm shooting in the proper format and resolution. Right now my camera is set for 1080 at 30 frames per second, but I want to shift to 4K. And I like doing that sometimes if I know I might need to crop the image later on so that I make sure I have a high quality crop. And the next thing I want to do here is set my white balance. Again, a lot of people use auto, which is dangerous because it can change frequently during the flight and between flights, and it makes it really difficult to color grade later on. Now you can set this to taste, but I'm just going to use sunny. Now the important thing is to keep it the same throughout your entire shoot for the day. That way all of your imagery is uniform as far as white balance is concerned. Now that we've got the white balance and resolution set, let's pop back in and make sure we have the exposure set. We're going to move that into manual to give us a little more flexibility. This first setting that I'm adjusting is called the ISO, and it's essentially just digital gain added to the image. It can be helpful in low light, but you can find yourself introducing a lot of digital grain if you turn it up too high. That's why I try to keep it at 100 if at all possible. And this next one that we're going to look at is called the Aperture, or the f-stop. And not all drones have a variable aperture, but the Mavic 2 Pro that we're using here does. And the aperture is essentially the opening that allows light in, and you can see as the number gets smaller, the opening gets larger and more light is allowed through, giving you a brighter image. A really high number gives you a darker image. I like to try to keep it around 4.5 if I can. And this last one is shutter speed. That is how long the shutter stays open to allow light in. You can see here right now at 1/60th of a second, it's very bright. Now in video we have a rule of thumb to give you natural looking motion blur, and that's that you want your shutter speed to be roughly twice what your frame rate is. So if you're shooting at 30 frames per second, you want your shutter speed to be at 1/60th if at all possible. If you're shooting at 60 frames per second, you want your shutter speed to be at 1/20th. So I use that, and from there I'll adjust my aperture to properly set the exposure that I'm looking for in the image. Again, trying to keep that ISO as low as possible. Luckily, that's not too big of an issue for me today outside. The sun is pretty bright. In fact, I actually have to have an ND filter on here in order to darken it up a little bit. And if you're not familiar with ND filters, they're essentially like sunglasses for your drone. If you plan on filming in a brightly lit environment, I highly recommend you pick a setup. Generally range between $70 and $150 depending on how many you want and whether or not you want polarized. I recommend Polar Pro as I found them to be the highest quality of the bunch. Now that we've got the exposure set to what I think is a pretty good area, let's take a look and see how it maybe changes as we look at different subjects. And I wanted to touch on this. I know I said earlier that I like to keep the aperture around 4.5, but you can see here I had to bump it up a little bit simply because it's so bright outside and I didn't want to have to land and switch out ND filters to a darker one. Still, when you're dealing with aerial video, you don't have to worry about the narrow depth of focus that you normally are concerned about when you're manipulating aperture with ground videography. So a little bit higher doesn't really impact you in the same way that it would if you were on the ground and up close to your subjects. And if you're interested in learning more about that, you can check out our Video Basics course where we go into more depth about aperture and how that can be used for creative effects as well in flight. But for this, you can see I'm looking at the ground. Everything looks fairly well exposed. There are some pretty significant shadows there for the players, but if I were to expose it any brighter, it would create some issues and some of the grass would be blown out. And you can see here as I land a little bit and tilt up towards the sky, you can see some of those zebra stripes at the top of the image. And if you're not familiar with those, that is letting me know that that part of the image is overexposed. And that makes perfect sense since I set the exposure for the ground, and now that I'm looking at the bright sky, it's going to be a little blown out. And the danger with that is that once the image is blown out, that means that that data is gone. You cannot recover it in post-processing. That's why I tend to err on the side of underexposing a shot, simply because in post you can generally bring out a little more brightness, but once that detail is gone due to overexposure, there's not a whole lot you can do after the fact. That's why it's generally a good idea to try to set your exposure for the brightest area of your shot. And if you're doing still photography, you can take advantage of HDR or AEB or automatic exposure bracketing modes, where the aircraft will take multiple shots at different exposures and then blend them all together to give you the best of all of those shots. Before we wrap up today, I wanted to take a look at one other tool that's very useful for monitoring your exposure, and that's the histogram. And you can see here we turn that on in the settings, and immediately you get this graphical representation of your exposure. Now, the way that the histogram works is that on the left-hand side of that screen is the shadows of your image. The middle of that graph shows the midtones, and the far right shows the highlights. And you can see here that this image has a high peak there on the highlight side, and that's mostly because of the bright exposure of the volleyball pit. But watch what's going to happen to that histogram as we tilt up towards the sky. You can see that as we start shifting over towards the sun, you get a huge peak there on the highlight side, specifically because now of the brightly lit sky. And as we get over directly towards the sun, again, you can see that huge peak there, as well as quite a bit in the midtone section for the grass and the trees. And that huge peak on the highlights obviously is not a good thing. What you want to see an ideal histogram look like is an evenly distributed edge-to-edge bump in the middle. And this one isn't ideal, obviously, because it has a huge spike there in the midtones, which means that the image is somewhat dull and doesn't have a whole lot of contrast. But again, this is just an introduction to the histogram. If you want to learn more about how to use that to properly expose your shots and what a good histogram should look like, feel free to check out our video basics course at DroneAcademy.com. And thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully you found this video useful. If you did, please give us a like and a subscribe. And if there's anything else you want to know about this or any other drone related topics, please let us know in the comments below. Until next time, have fun and fly safe.